evidence truly was as solid as you're proposing, why is not everyone a believer? I mean, because you can always say that, like, well, those people who wrote the Bible lied, well, they were incorrect, well, they were mistaken. I mean, how solid really is that evidence? If you didn't live there and see it with your own eyes and actually watch it happen, how can you take the word of those men over my word when saying that that Jesus Christ wasn't the Son of God? Like, what makes them so credible?
Eyewitness testimony can get you and me thrown into jail. Eyewitness testimony can get you and me into the electric chair. It can get us executed.
Well, have you ever played telephone? I mean, that's eyewitness testimony right now. These are events that happened 2,000 years ago and have been translated into over 30 languages, right? I mean, how often do you think that has changed from what they originally wrote down?
Great point. But the New Testament that we have in English today has nothing to do with these many translations. We go right back to the Greek manuscripts to translate into English. So we don't go through French and Spanish and Armenian.
Aren't there differences in the Greek language and the English language, just as there are differences in the English language and every other language? Aren't there phrases that appear in Greek that can't be properly translated into English and things like that? I just feel like it would be such a meticulous and careful task having to translate it. Don't you find it at least a little bit hard to believe that they could translate everything completely perfectly from a completely different language 2,000 years ago?
I think that is part of your culture when you talk about perfect translation.
Well, what is my culture?
Your culture is computers, the internet. Your culture is a degree of precision in the area of mathematics and science that is totally unrealistic when it comes to historical knowledge. I can know something historically, not because I have a minute-by-minute, second-by-second account of exactly what happened, but I can know generally what happened. The guy at UCLA who debated with me that the Holocaust never took place
It's exactly
ridiculous.
Yeah, I know, I agree. That's exactly my point. And yet there are people who use shreds of evidence to try and say that the Holocaust didn't exist, or that 9/11 was caused by the government, or all these crazy things. And and there's pieces of evidence that they can point to. How is what you're proposing any different from those people who we both agree, I'm sure, are whack jobs?
You bet. Because when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, James, after you read those documents, to walk away saying they're whack jobs is really weak.
Also, didn't all of these guys live at the same time and know each other? Do you think it's very far-fetched that they could have collaborated on their works at all? Or?
Oh, undoubtedly they collaborated. They talked with each other. They had relationships. Paul gets a lot of his information from Peter and James and the other apostles. So they obviously had friendships, they collaborated, they talked. But these guys stood before Roman soldiers, and the Roman soldiers said, say Caesar is Lord. If you say Caesar is Lord, you live. But if you maintain that your Jesus is Lord, we'll kill you for it. And every single one of them said,
No,
I'm sorry, I've seen Jesus risen from the dead. He is Lord, and they died. Not for a belief. They died for what they claimed to have seen. The dead Christ risen from the dead.
So don't you think that they said, no, that's not how it happened, like you got this wrong? And I mean, obviously if they're living at the same time and writing what's basically the same story, that they're going to be fact-checking with each other, and it's not, it's almost like four guys writing the same book together. Like, don't you think, I just don't think it's that much different from just one guy writing the book.
Okay. First point is, there are some significant differences in the different letters. That's why so many people say to me, they contradict each other. No, they don't contradict each other, but they definitely give different perspectives.
I agree.
So, they're not carbon copies. Second point, one of the reasons that those Gospels and New Testament letters demand so much respect is because of their brutal honesty about their mistakes. For instance, Peter, he acknowledges that Jesus is the Christ. A few verses later, Jesus has to say to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of man." Imagine a group of guys getting together and creating this fictitious teaching of Jesus, do not lust. Give me a break. I don't think a bunch of guys are going to get together and say, hey, you know, let's dream up a teaching and try and persuade people that this teaching is credible. Guess what, guys? You're not to lust after women. No. Not the way to win a bunch of guys' allegiance, right? Also, Jesus crying out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is that something you want to make up in order to convince people that Jesus is really God in human form? Questioning his own identity? I doubt it. So you see, when you read those Gospels and when you read the New Testament honestly, it's amazing how vulnerable they are in putting the truth forth plainly, not in this watertight compartment. There are problems, there are challenges, but I like that. That has the ring of credibility to me. If it's all whitewashed, I'm not impressed.
But at the end of the day, how can you actually know that what they wrote down was true, or whether or not it was just a lie for some ends that we may not know?
You bet. Well, it's the same way I read any document. I first of all look at the literary style. Is it mythology? Is it once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wynken, Blynken, and Nod took a boat ride? Or is it at this time, in this place, with these people around, Jesus said this and did that? Obviously, the Gospels are not mythology, they're historical narrative. Then, what about contradictions? Do they contradict each other? No, there's a tremendous internal consistency. Then what about archaeology? Did Jesus float a boat and float it to the island of Atlantis? No. Sea of Galilee, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, archaeologically verifiable places. Well, I'll put the Quran through that. I'll put any historical document through that. And then you raise the telephone game issue, which is a great issue. How do we know that the Gospels haven't just been perverted over the past 2,000 years? Well, we know that because today we have over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript that the New Testament's based on, all agreeing to an infinitesimal degree, dated from the 2nd through the 10th century AD.
It's a pretty big gap, don't you think?
What?
2nd to the 10th century, 800 years.
Yeah. But the manuscripts in the 10th century agree with the manuscripts from the 2nd century.
Just as our manuscripts today are supposed to agree with those manuscripts, don't you think?
Yeah, but if there's a problem, then we got a problem. But if there's consistency, then that demands respect and heightens credibility.
Well, don't you think that that consistency could have just possibly come from reading the earlier documents and then reproducing those in the same fashion?
Sure, it could have come about that way. But then the question is, what does the evidence point to? And the evidence is that those Gospels in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century, in Greek, are totally consistent. Are there mistakes? Yes, a plethora of mistakes. As Bart Ehrman from Chapel Hill likes to point out, there are about 200 to 400,000 manuscript variants in the 25,000 manuscripts that we have back from the first 10 centuries.
Isn't that problematic?
Well, Bart Ehrman's a rascal because in his footnotes he points out that those 200 to 400,000 manuscript variants are found in 25,000 manuscripts. So that means how many mistakes are there for each manuscript? If you got 25,000 manuscripts and there are 200 to 400,000 variants, then you've got 8 to 16 variants per manuscript. That's stinking incredible. It's amazing.
I would agree.